continuing our monthly series on Suwannee County's history. And I know it's actually May, and this really is more fitting in October-ish, but by popular demand, I was asked to just continue as I was going through our history. And so we're going to be talking about haunted history of Suwannee County. More troubling facets kind of our history, some ghost stories, those kinds of things, haunts, and whatnot like that. So all kind of encompassing as we go through this. I've got this warning: disturbing images and statements, viewer discretion is advised. That's to keep any lawyers at bay. You never know about them, so just in case, that's that. So we're going to go back way before we were the United States, way before there was a United States, and look at some of the Native Americans that lived in this area 500 years ago plus. We're going to specifically talk about the Timucua here, or Timucua, depending on who you talk to, two different ways to pronounce it. But this Native American group lived here when the Europeans arrived in Florida in the 1500s. They lived in this part of Florida and also up into Georgia. So their name, they did not call themselves this. Their name comes from the word Themagona, which means my enemy. This is basically what happened was when the Europeans arrived on the coast around St. Augustine, Jacksonville, that area, they asked who lived in the interior, and that Indian group said Themagona, my enemy. Well, the Europeans thought, well, that was the name of them, so it came to be anglicized the Timucuas. So that's what we call them. That's not what they called themselves, but that's what we call them. Now, there were anywhere between 20,000 and 200,000 of these Native Americans in North Florida and Georgia. Lots of different things. You can see they were heavily tattooed. That's kind of one of their marks, especially the men or the males. When they were young, as they would start doing great things. Maybe they'd kill a deer or an alligator or fight in battle. Every time they did some great deed, they would be rewarded by having a tattoo. So as you got older, you'd have more and more tattoos. So that is something that was noticed by the Europeans. And we know more about them than a lot of these other Native American groups because the Europeans wrote about them. Specifically, especially the Spanish, but also the French, to an extent the English. So we've got kind of lots of knowledge on these Native American groups. This one particularly no longer exists. They are extinct. The last known Timucuan died in 1767. So as far as we know, there's none anymore. It's possible some lived into maybe even the early 1800s in the Everglades and places like that, and or they mixed and mingled with the later groups that came after them, like the Seminoles and such. But this Indian group, one of the things they did, kind of, it's not haunted per se, but just kind of the weird and odd things they would do. When they went to battle, they would scalp you like we hear, all the Indian movies, John Wayne movies about getting scalped and stuff. They would do that. They'd smoke the scalp over a fire, and then make little headbands out of them. They'd also then hang it from the spears to show they had conquered them. They would also dismember these enemy warriors you can see in these pictures closer to the front. They would dismember them, chop off their legs and their arms and whatnot. And then kind of like the creme de la creme, the end of things would be they would shove an arrow up the rear end to show they have totally defeated the enemy. And so I guess a pain in the rear. I'm not saying it comes from that, but we could joke that that's where it comes from. But as we get into Suwannee County specifically and the Timucua, when Hernando de Soto came through here in 1539, he encountered the Timucuan Native Americans in this region, and through a series of captures, I guess you could put it, he captured some of the Indians to use as translators or to use as collateral to get through Indian territory to the next group. And as he came through here, after he landed in Tampa Bay, he was able to capture the village chief's daughter, the chief of Alquiliquan, which was down around the Branford, Ishtuckney Springs area. So Alquiliquan came to him asking for his daughter back, and De Soto captured him too. So you see these captures of various high-ranking Timucuan officials. And Alquiliquan was not just not just the chief of that village, he was more like the regional governor. And so a lot of other villages around answered to him. And they were not happy that DeSoto had captured him. So they started sending threatening remarks, comments, those kinds of things. And DeSoto's men just kind of laughed him off, saying, yeah, no big deal. Didn't bother the Spaniards. If it was another Native American group, it would have bothered them. They probably would have turned them back over to his people. But it didn't bother DeSoto and his men. In 1539, September 16th, the Timucuans decided, let's come pretending to be friends to sit down and talk with DeSoto, but actually let's attack him. Let's ambush and send thousands of our warriors to attack. And so that's what happened. But DeSoto got wind of it. He found out what was going on and laid a trap for them. And so his men, he only had a few hundred men, were up against thousands of Timucua Indians in probably Suwannee County at a place called Napatuca. And so the Spaniards routed the Timucua Indians. They captured many of them after encircling one of the ponds or the lakes nearby the village of Napatuca and captured them. Well, he kind of wanted them to be peaceful. He just wanted to move on. He was just exploring, looking for gold, those kinds of things. And so he released the chief of Alcaliquan and these other village chiefs that were around that attacked, hoping that they would just allow the Spaniards to peacefully go through the rest of their area. Well, that didn't work. Alcaliquan and some of the other ones kind of basically rose up in rebellion. And DeSoto decided, all right, enough is enough. I'm just going to kill these guys. So he and his men massacred hundreds of Timucua warriors and chiefs. They kept the kids and the women as slaves and other slaves for the men as they continued to march westward. This battle was called Battle of the Lakes, Battle of the Ponds, Battle of Napatuca, a great seminal victory. I mean, it's a great victory of DeSoto against the Timucua. DeSoto's men crossed over the Suwannee River, went into the Tallahassee area, and basically camped there for the winter. But a couple months later, DeSoto wants to bring up more supplies and some more stuff, so he sends some of his horsemen, his cavalry, back through the route that they had come through to go down to the Tampa Bay area to retrieve some more supplies. And when they came through Napatuca and that area, basically they were kind of shocked because they found that the natives, the ones that had survived, believed Napatuca and the surrounding area was evil. It was full of evil spirits and that stuff. And so they burned the village and they left all the dead bodies out to rot. Not something Native Americans were usually known for. They're known for burials and such. But the surviving Timucua believed that it was such an evil place that we can't touch it. We got to burn it and leave. And so that's what DeSoto's men found 2 months later. So very interesting. So we're not sure. Who knows if the ghosts of those warriors that were slain still haunt that area around Napatuca. And we're not even 100% sure of where Napatuca is. There are some thoughts that it is in Suwannee County, around Houston, around the golf course, maybe Gum Slough, somewhere around there. Just, we don't know exactly where it was. But that's the thought. Maybe some of those spirits wander the area because of the deaths they suffer. Moving ahead over 100 years, we go from the 1500s to the 1600s, and we're still going to talk about the Timucua. By this point, in the mid-1600s, Spain has started to colonize Florida, not just exploration, but now we are establishing places like St. Augustine, Pensacola, and communities throughout, especially the north part of the state. They've established what's called the Camino Real, the Royal Road, that goes between Pensacola and St. Augustine. So that goes through Suwannee County. About where Charles Springs is where it crosses the river. And so they've established mission sites. And these missions were not just where they would try to convert the Timucua, but also you'd have maybe a place to stay, you'd have a place to eat, those kinds of things. So little communities were developing all throughout the north part of Florida, including Suwannee County. Well, in 1656, the Timucua rise up in rebellion. Basically what has been happening is the Spaniards have been taking the population, or a lot of the male population anyway, to places like Pensacola or St. Augustine to build. Because Florida is a pretty poor colony. there's not a lot of good money producing things. And so you don't see the influx of colonists as you would say up north in the north part of what's now the United States, or in Cuba where they had sugar cane, those kinds of places. So there's not enough Spaniards coming in to build the colony up, so the Spaniards instead used the Native Americans to build, basically the menial labor. And so they are using these Timucua men especially to build forts, to build houses, to build buildings. And that is further exasperating this decline of the Timucuan civilization, because not only are they dying by warfare between the French and the English and the Spanish, not only are they dying from all these diseases that are being spread by the Europeans, but they're also now not producing enough kids because the men are out of town most of the time, building stuff for the Spanish. And so it just kind of boils over. The boiling point is reached when the English are threatening an attack on St. Augustine. And so the Spanish governor here in Florida, Robledo, calls up the militia, which includes a lot of the natives, because there's not enough Spanish here to serve as the full-fledged militia. They use the natives as some of those soldiers. And so he basically calls up the militia to come defend St. Augustine. Well, the Native Americans in this area of Florida don't like that. They're tired of it. And so they basically rise up and rebel against the Spanish authorities. They kill a few folks, including a guy named Geronimo, not the Geronimo that you usually hear of in the 1800s, but another Indian guy named Geronimo. They are killed probably around Royal Springs. He and a friend of his are basically camping for the evening as they travel on one of these back roads, and they are killed and scalped as they're sitting there talking. And several other people are killed by the Timucua Indians from Gainesville northward, basically, this area. Governor Robledo can't do anything about it. He is basically dealing with the threat of the English. That's more important. And so he just has to put that aside for now. Well, hurricane season comes, the English decide, we're not going to attack this year. And so that frees up the governor to now go after these Timucuan rebels who have holed up. They crossed the Suwannee River to Madison County and have holed up in a fort. And so after some protracted negotiations, these leaders and these Timucua Indians surrender to the Spanish authorities without a battle. Well, the Spanish say thank you for that. All these chiefs, which most of them were from Suwannee County and the surrounding area, they execute them in various nice and not so nice methods. And so, there's the thought that perhaps some of those chiefs are still looking for more victims out in Suwannee County and the surrounding region. Don't know. Some other ones, some other mentions of ghosts. It might have something to do with this rebellion or this defeat at Napatuca 100 years prior to that. There was a reporting from January 2007, and I'm going to read a lot of quotes through this presentation, just to let y'all know what people have written. A person was staying in the Spirit of the Suwannee Music Park, north side of the county, back in January of 2007, and they said, quote, "It was only like 8 p.m. and I went to swim in a small section of the park of the river. It was very cold and I was freezing. I was the only one out there. I got out of the water and was looking in the sand for my towel when I swear on my soul a man dressed in circa 1400 Native American clothing. He walked right into the water without even looking at me and kneeled over to take a drink. I blinked several times thinking it was the dark playing tricks, but he was still there. He stood up and within the blink of an eye was gone. I still go to the park every January, so somebody thinks they saw something out there at the Spirit of the Suwannee. That looked like perhaps one of these Timucua Indians that were from that era. But there weren't just Timucua living here in that colonial history. Again, Spain had taken over Florida. They claimed it as their own, and there were settlers that moved into what's now Suwannee County. And it was the frontier. You didn't have a lot of goods, you didn't have a lot of supplies, you didn't have a lot of things that many Spanish had come to get used to back in the homeland. And so it was really kind of the frontier. And so there is the story of this woman. Basically on the Santa Fe River, there is a ghost supposedly that walks along the river. And from what the stories that I have read and understood, basically the story goes that she is a ghost of a Spanish colonial era woman. And basically She had come over with her family, her husband had come over, and she had come with them and with the kids, and she had found a lover. And so she wanted to elope with this lover, leave her husband, leave her kids, and elope with this lover and abandon her husband and the two girls. But the lover rejected her. And so she went back home after shooting him. She went back home, and in a crazed state, she drowned her daughters in the Santa Fe River, and then she jumped in and drowned herself. And so according to the stories, she apparently roams the banks, screaming and crying loudly that she hates men with a passion, and she'll go after them and attack them. So if one of us guys, I don't go down there, but if you're down the Santa Fe River one night and you hear a shrieking woman coming at you, run away just to be safe. Just to be safe. It says she has a flowing white gown, so you can recognize her by that. She may be speaking Spanish, I don't know. But that's one of those ghost stories that are local to Suwannee County. Moving ahead from Spanish colonization of Florida to the time that where it is shifting from Spain to become an American territory, and we've got Reuben and Rebecca Charles, who are our first known American settlers. They're here by 1824. They set up shop on the Suwannee River at a place that is now called Charles Springs. Mr. Charles, Reuben Charles, had been working in Spanish Florida for several years. He had lived over in Jacksonville area. He had lived up in the Carolinas, trading ships back and forth. But he knew when when the United States took over Florida as a territory, he knew where they were going to put a road in, the federal highway in, which was basically going to follow that old Spanish road, the old Camino Real. And he knew that it was going to have to cross the Suwannee River at what's now Charles Springs. So he bought up that property so he could establish a ferry there. They didn't have bridges, they had ferry crossings. And so he established that ferry there, and not just a ferry, but a trading post and an inn. So he basically set up one-stop shop. You could come there, you could stay, you could get supplies, you could cross the river, and whatever it was, you paid Mr. Charles. So he got pretty well off, money-wise. He also, an odd thing for the early 1800s for a white man, he was friendly with the local natives. Now the Temuco, again, they were gone by this point, but in the interim, while Spain had taken over Florida and before the United States got it, other Native American groups had fled into Florida. The upper and lower creeks, the Yamasee, things like that, and they kind of conglomerated to form what was anglicized to become the Seminoles, probably from the Spanish word Cimarron, which means runaway. And so the Seminole Indians were here by the late 1700s, early 1800s. Reuben and Rebecca Charles were one of the few white people that were actually friendly with them. Now, one of the stipulations that they had was, so we can recognize that it's you, Mr. Charles, and your family, you wear like a red scarf. You and your family wear a red scarf. And we'll know not to kill you, unlike everybody else that we want to kill, who's taken over our land. And so that goes on for many years. They're good to go. A lot of other communities are attacked, but the Charles outpost there at Charles Springs is not attacked by them. Now, Reuben Charles, you can see here, according to this, died in 1835. Some sources say 1836. It just depends. But basically, at the end of 1835 is when the Second Seminole War begins. And a lot of that is fought in North Florida, between Central Florida and North Florida, are where a lot of battles and massacres happen. So he is killed basically at the start of that war. Some of the stories have said that he died he was killed while walking on the banks of the Suwannee River. But he dies. His wife, Rebecca, continues to operate the trading post and the inn and the ferry. Now, during that war, that Second Seminole War, which was our longest war until Vietnam, started in 1835, ended in 1842, Charles Springs was used as an army post. Basically, the federal government set up various army posts throughout all of the north part of Florida, at least, and central part of Florida, to protect the settlers that were moving in and to attack the Indians as need be. And so Charles Springs was one of those posts. So she would provide water, supplies, those kinds of things for the American troops that were stationed there. The war in 1842, Rebecca Charles continued to operate those things for another 10 years. In 1852, she was shot and killed on her front porch. It was not a Native American that did it because had all been pushed out of this area. Could have been some settler that didn't like the fact that they had been friendly with the Indians, with the Native Americans. We don't know. Unsolved murder, so to speak. Also, about their family, another part was their daughter Mary. They had several kids, but one of them was named Mary. And as a teenager, somewhere around the time of the Seminole War, Second Seminole War, maybe just before it, basically, she was excited to find out that the stagecoach was coming with mail. Perhaps she had a boyfriend or something out of town, and she was wanting to get the mail, so she rushed out to get the mail, forgetting to put her scarf on, and a Seminole didn't recognize her and shot and killed her. And so she was killed kind of unnaturally. The Charles family, many of them are still buried out there by Charles Springs, just to the, I guess it'd be to the east, and a little to the south of Charles Springs. So they're buried there, kind of met untimely deaths, I guess you could say, unfortunately. It's actually on an Indian burial ground is where they buried the bodies, which is very close to one of the old Spanish missions, San Juan de Guacara, which San Juan de Guacara was the Spanish name for the Suwannee River, and it means St. John of Antiquity, talking about John the Apostle. It got anglicized eventually to Suwannee. So anyway, kind of one of those untimely deaths. You never know what's going on. But again, Second Seminole War is happening, and not only are get word that the Seminoles were leaving, the war was basically going to be over. And so these citizens who had been holed up in forts or fortified areas wanted to go back to their farms. And so they would get wind that, okay, the Seminoles are giving up, they're moving out to the Oklahoma Territory, to the Indian Territory. And so these citizens went back to their farms. And one of them was a guy by the name of William Clemens, or Clements, depending on the version. But he apparently had he and his family had been living temporarily at Suwannee Springs, or one of the other forts in the area. And they get word of this, and so they go back home to their place, somewhere maybe around Lyvet, Welborn, we don't know for sure. But basically, he leaves his wife and his 4 children there. Well, he goes back to the fort to get the rest of their belongings. Well, unfortunately for the rest of the family, the Seminoles have not all left, and they see Mr. Clemens leave, and so they see easy pickings. And so Mr. Clemens comes back a couple of days later, and he finds that his entire family has been massacred. They've been left out on the ground, and there are feral hogs eating the corpses. Not a good thing to find your family. Not good. Several other raids in Suwannee County and massacres during the war. The last known one that I have found anyway was in 1842, the year the war ended, and it was in February of 1842. And I've talked about this one before in other presentations, but basically over at what is now Welborn, it used to be called the community of Little River. It was established by a guy by the name of George McClellan in the 1830s. He was postmaster there, and militia, a captain, all kinds of different things. Well, he writes to the governor in this case. This is writing to the governor, who was, Governor Call at the time, writing to the governor about this massacre that has happened in his neighborhood. And basically it was the family of Dick Tillis, Richard Tillis, or Tullis, he calls him Tully in here, but Dick Tillis is his name. And Mr. Tillis was helping another neighbor build a house. And so he's left his family kind of back home. But the war is more or less over. Most of the Seminoles have already left Florida, and they're out in Indian Territory, or they've been pushed down south, where the federal government assures them that no American is going to want to ever live, so they're pushed down South Florida. Kind of lied on that, I guess. So people are thinking things are back to normal. Mr. Tillis is helping one of his neighbors build a house. And by neighbor, we're talking about big farms and plantation type stuff. So the nearest neighbor might be 2 miles away. So regardless, what happens is after Mr. Tillis is gone, his wife and his family are attacked by the Seminoles. So I'm just going to kind of stand here and read it for you. Little River, which at this point we're part of Columbia County, so it's from Little River, Columbia County, East Florida. At that point, from a military standpoint, Florida is divided up into East Florida, which was east of the Suwannee River, and West Florida, which was west of the Suwannee. And he writes on February 28, 1842, to His Excellency R.K. Call, Governor of Florida, sirs, with feelings of the deepest regret that I am compelled to inform you of one of the most barbarous acts of Indian depredation. On Thursday last at noon, 7 or 8 Indians were discovered in a half or 3/4 of a mile of my house, making towards a neighboring house. I immediately sent a runner to that house to apprise them, and through the neighborhood for the same purpose. But before the news could reach around in Mr. Richard Tully's family, about 2 miles from me, he being absent on business, fell victims to their barbarity in the following distressing manner. The lady, Mrs. T, was shot dead. A young lady who was staying there attempted to run off with Mrs. T's infant, 2 weeks old, but was run after by an Indian, overtaken, knocked down with the limb of a tree, and stabbed under each arm, or nearly so, to the hollow. She is yet alive. A little girl, 8 years old, was shot with an arrow in the back, the barber spike made of iron, severing off part of the bone and lodging under a rib. She died last night. A little boy, 6 years old, was shot with an arrow in the back, near the bone, and came out near the navel. He is yet alive. The next oldest was killed dead with an arrow, and the next oldest, a boy, was shot through the body and died on Friday night. All the children were shot and the arrows left in them, except the infant, which was not interrupted. The house was stripped, and the Indians made their escape. I pursued them the next day with 24 men. He was in charge of the local militia. He was a captain. So he pursued them the next day with 24 men, but did not overtake them until they had crossed the Suwannee. And on the opposite bank, they were discovered, but out of gunshot, and no possibility of crossing the river. Thus were we disappointed of revenge. The steamboat that came after the troops at Fort McComb was down between Branford and Lurville on the Suwannee River, across the Suwannee River. Steamboat that came after the troops at Fort McComb, as I am told, on its return discovered, or the men on her saw Indian rafts on this side of the river, and neither destroyed them, pursued the Indians, nor informed us of it. However, Major Raines at Fort White came with the doctor from that fort to see the wounded of Tully's family, and promised to do all in his power for us. On receiving information of this murder, he sent for aid to Camp Fanning, which is Fanning Springs now, that area, and a company of dragoons were immediately, or as soon as possible, and returned to Camp Fanning to recross the river, come up after them. But alas, it is too late. They cannot, I fear, overtake them. Yesterday, about 10 in the morning, they made an attack on Mr. Osteen's house, 1.5 miles from the natural bridge on the Santa Fe River, killing Mrs. O, and was still firing on the house when the express left for Alligator. Alligator is now Lake City. The particulars of this transaction are yet to be learned. I fear the worst. I start off again tomorrow after them. Signs were discovered within a few miles of this 1 day since. Unless we get aid speedily, the country must be abandoned. Not a soldier is on the frontier of the country, except at Fort White, leaving Santa Fe and Suwannee free for them to live on. This is protection. I have said this much that you may be correctly informed of matters in this vicinity. Hoping to hear from you soon. I am, sir, your obedient servant, George E. McClellan. So these things can be pretty barbaric. Indian massacres. Bad things going on. So that family, Dick Tullis's family, is buried out close to Weldon in the Carver Cemetery. So just one of those bad things. Again, not all this is ghost stories per se, but it's distressing things that have happened in Suwannee County. Moving ahead a few decades, Florida is now a state of the Union, and the Civil War has begun, pitting the North versus the South. Lewis Thornton Powell, who lived here in Suwannee County, has, at the age of 17, joined the Confederate Army. He is the son of a preacher. I'm not going to start singing the Son of a Preacher Man song either. But he was the son of a preacher who lived here, George Powell, and he goes off and serves in the Jasper or the Hamilton Blues of the Confederate Army. He fights through several different campaigns, the Peninsular Campaign, Fredericksburg, I believe, but then he is captured at Gettysburg. He manages to escape with the aid of a nurse, and he travels about the north, especially around Maryland and such. He is introduced to John Wilkes Booth, befriends him, and agrees to help John Wilkes Booth in the assassination of President Lincoln. President Lincoln. So he is involved in that assassination. John Wilkes Booth, the night that he is at Ford's Theater killing President Lincoln, Lewis Thornton Powell, now 21 years old of Live Oak, is going to the House of Secretary of State, Seward, and trying to kill him. He wounds him and several others, does not actually kill him, and then flees into a cemetery for a couple days. He is captured. He is found guilty along with the other conspirators and sentenced to death. His father, George Powell, is still here. He's still preaching. He's still performing marriage ceremonies. We have in our records at the courthouse where George C. Powell was performing ceremonies up through the middle of 1866. But he is trying to get up to see his son before the execution. But Mr. Powell gets sick, is unable to see his son executed. And so we have a picture there of the execution. I've circled Lewis Thornton Powell there in the red. He was the tallest one there, also the youngest one. And the newspapers wrote more about him than any of the other conspirators, except for Mary Surratt, the woman to his left, who was basically the first woman that's going to be executed by the federal government. So that was a big deal for sure. And so they were hanged 3 months after the assassination of Lincoln. And Powell was buried near the gallows there with the other folks. And then perhaps it was moved to Central Florida. Perhaps it was moved to a cemetery in Washington, D.C. But regardless, that was supposedly the end of Lewis Thornton Powell. However, in 1993, I believe, they found his skull in the Smithsonian Institution in a Native American area. It was mislabeled as a Native American artifact, but on the skull itself was written his name, and he was a conspirator in the Lincoln assassination. So the skull was returned in that box. It was buried at the family cemetery, which the family after 1866 had moved to Central Florida. And so it was buried there in what's now Seminole County. So, who knows if his headless corpse is wandering around somewhere looking for vengeance. Other weird kind of things going on, Reconstruction. Because of Lincoln's death, radical Reconstruction was enacted on the South, including Florida. And that basically, for several years, depending on which state you lived in, that pretty much enacted military occupation of that state. Florida had it for basically 3 years under military governor, Governor Meade, who was a General Meade. So a lot of higher-ups were military, but eventually the South and Florida particularly was allowed to recreate a new constitution in 1868 and allowed to start re-electing people. Well, it was a bad time, Reconstruction. You've got a lot of folks that have moved from the North down to the South. You've got a lot of folks that were in the South who claimed to be, or who were actually against the Civil War. You've got a lot of back and forth, brothers fighting brothers, families fighting other families. And you've got organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan that are rising up during this era. Lots of other ones, but KKK is the most well-known today. But you've got them rising up, and you've got African Americans that are allowed to participate in government during this era, during Reconstruction, which brings up its own headaches for some of those that lived here and did not like that. So you've got a lot of things going on. Northerners versus Southerners, carpetbaggers versus scallywags, whites versus African Americans, all kinds of issues, and you've got these groups that are rising up and that are causing trouble. So in 1871, the federal government commissions a joint select committee to study the condition of the affairs of what they call the, quote, the late insurrectionary states. And so there were multiple books written about it. Each state had its own book, except for Florida. Florida was the smallest population-wise at the time. So it was all these different states, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and then this last book was miscellaneous in Florida. We were back then. So the Secretary of State here in Florida, Jonathan Gibbs, who was an African-American man, He talked to the commission about the number of murders he knew about that were related to race relations or related to this North versus South thing. And some of the figures are disputed, but he quoted Lafayette County had 4, Taylor County had 7, Hamilton County had 9, Suwannee County had 10, Columbia had 16, Alachua 16, Madison 20. But then Jackson County, you do not want to live over there in Mariana because they had 153. They had more, as much as anybody else combined. Madison County Sheriff argued and said, we didn't have 20, there actually were 37. So even those numbers were probably low. Lots of issues. Sheriff of Columbia County was run out of town. A lot of Republican officials were either killed or scared off, and all kinds of things going on. Even in our records, when you come to the courthouse and look at our, for instance, county commission records, you will see that the commissioners normally serve a 4-year term. During that era, very few people got to serve 4 years. They were on and off like crazy. They were getting run off, they were getting scared, they were resigning, they were getting kicked out of office, just all kinds of ways. One of the murders happened in 1871 on October 5th, and it was Dr. John Newton Criminger. Now, he was a Republican judge, the county judge down in Lafayette County. He had been a Union sympathizer during the war, and he was killed on the front porch of his home down at New Troy, which at the time was the county seat of Lafayette County. He was shot by the former Lafayette County clerk of the court, John C. Fonchier. He had been removed from the office by the governor, and Judge Criminger had put his son-in-law in as the clerk. So there was a little bit of hatred there, a little bit of aggravation. And so Criminger was shot from the second floor of the courthouse there in Lafayette County by the former clerk, who then fled and absconded. These records, which this is just a portion of them, talks about the fact that the federal government could not track him down, or the officials could not track him down, because he had lots of friends in Suwannee County. So he would come over to Suwannee County and hide, and he'd also go hide in the swamps and places like that. He was eventually killed in 1873, found and killed. So, you know, kind of weird things going on with the South in general, but particularly in Suwannee County. Talking about ghosts, sometimes it's not a person we're talking about, but it's a community or a town. Columbus is one of those ghost towns we have here in Suwannee County. Here my notes are like a 2-point. But basically, Columbus was one of our earliest communities. We had a post office there by 1842, which was 15 plus years before Live Oak was established. It was 15 plus years before Suwannee County became Suwannee County. But there was a post office there in 1842. It became a town, the town of Columbus, in 1844. It was at the junction of the Withlacoochee and the Suwannee Rivers. It's where the Suwannee River State Park is today. And basically it was a booming town in the 1840s, the 1850s. 500 plus people at least were living just in that town, within the town limits of that square mile. You had tons of bales of cotton that were being produced. Steamboats were coming upriver to it. Sawmills, all kinds of things going on. But gradually after things were starting to change, the Civil War had an issue, had an impact on it. It was the railroad bridge that had been built there through Suwannee County. It crossed there at Columbus, and that railroad basically went pretty much past Tallahassee over to Jacksonville, Pensacola, Georgia, but it didn't connect either place. But it was still basically the major railroad in Florida at the time of the Civil War. And when the North invaded in 1864, landed in Jacksonville, were going to be marching westward, Confederate troops built a last-ditch defensive works there at that bridge in what's now Suwannee River State Park. And the northern forces were defeated at Olustee in February, so they didn't get this far. But it was still here. After the Civil War, things changed. More ferries were built elsewhere, bridges started to be built, other communities were established, Live Oak had grown, became the county seat. So Columbus pretty much died off. And so today, it's a ghost town. You can still see the cemetery, you can see part of old sawmills and that kind of stuff, steamboat parks, those kinds of things there. You can see the old ferry landing. You can see the old earthenworks. You can see where part of the old bridge used to be. So So it's not a ghost person so much as it is a ghost town. So post-Civil War, you've got more people moving in, some from the north, some from the south, other parts of the south, but you've got communities springing up. And one of those that lives in Suwannee County is a guy by the name of Washington Lafayette Irvin, W.L. Irvin. And he establishes a community called Lurville, down at Lurville, on the Suwannee River. It is named after his young daughter, Laura, L-U-R-A, which is why it's spelled like that. Some people call it Laura, or spell it L-A-U-R-A, but it's L-U-R-A in the records, most of them. And it was established before 1878. And so he was a bigwig, one of these, kind of like George McClellan or Reuben Charles, who had established all kinds of businesses in that area. So he's got the ferry, this ferry here, Irvin's Ferry. That's possibly him right here at the front, Mr. Irvin. He's got sawmill, he's got just grist mills, he's got all kinds of different things. Basically, steam mills, just entrepreneur there, that live there. And he establishes that. His wife dies, Laura's mother dies, and then he shortly thereafter dies also. And so Laura, who is still young, is cared for by her uncle and her cousin on his side, and uncle on her mother's side, Dr. Perry McIntosh, who lives down in Lurville, builds a nice home there in Lurville. She's related to the Ivies of Brantford, all that kind of stuff. So lots of local connections here with the McIntosh family and the Ivy family and others. Unfortunately for Laura, she was horribly burned in a girls' dormitory fire in December of 1888. Now what happened was Dr. McIntosh sent her off to a boarding school in White Springs, according to the records. We have the courthouse, looks like White Springs, which had a lot of boarding house type places and schools, academies, those kinds of things. And so he sent her off, he and his wife sent Laura off there to be educated, better than what she could be educated in Lurville. And she was horribly burned in a dormitory fire in 1888, December, basically Christmas Day kind of thing. They were having a party, if you will, and a candle got too close to her dress and the dress caught fire. She was horribly burned. She came back to this house, which is the Perry McIntosh house down in Lurville. She was brought back, and he tried to tend to her injuries, but she died the next day on December 26th. And this is one of those ghost stories I've heard about from several different folks. Supposedly her ghost still roams that house and nearby there. And actually it's so well known that several years ago, I had some professional ghost hunters call me trying to get information on the history of the family and that house. So very interesting stuff. Of course, the house is still there. Interesting stuff. Another ghost story. J.C. Powell, Captain John C. Powell, was in charge of the convict labor camps here in Suwannee County. And basically, these convict camps were established after Reconstruction ended. The South, not just Florida, but the South in general, was very poor. A lot of people have been taking money. They moved in. They'd taken over government. They had pilfered the coffers of the states and then left. And so when Reconstruction ended, the locals who had gone back into office by this point were trying to look for money. They're trying to raise money how they could. And so this idea was brought up of, hey, let's rent out, let's lease our prisoners to the highest bidder. And they can use them as convict labor. Basically, it's going to give us money, the state money. We don't have to provide housing and stuff for these folks because this company is going to do that. And then the company gets to rent these guys cheaper than what they could hire somebody to do. So it was kind of a win-win situation for everybody but the convicts. So John C. Powell, J.C. Powell, was in charge of these convict camps. And he writes a book called American Siberia. If you haven't seen it, should be a copy here. About 400 pages. You can download it online if you want to. Great book, great book. The book starts, and most of the book is in Suwannee County. It starts off at the old railroad depot in Live Oak, boom. And that's when he is being introduced to these convicts. And so he's writing about it, and they would move from place to place. A lot of the things they would do would be turpentine industry stuff. They would work on timber. They'd also build some of the railroads that came through Suwannee County after the Civil War. So they were involved in lots of different things. And one of the times, 1870s and 1880s, he writes in this book a particular story, kind of creepy. And I'm just going to try to read it for you. It says, quote, "It was the ghost of a little child that came to me, and it happened thus. My brother and myself both had houses near the camp," that'd be the convict camp at the time. "My wife had been for some time wishing to visit her family in South Georgia, and finally made the trip, taking with her the children, including our youngest boy, a baby 5 months old, to whom I was much attached. All through the arrangements, I was oppressed with a vague and indefinable presentiment of calamity, but as I could give no reason for it, I could not well oppose the visit. They had been gone 3 days, and at night, after counting the men and going through the usual routine of the camp, I went home and retired, but I could not sleep. The shadowy forebodings that had weighed upon me grew into a keen sense of danger, I knew not what, and thrilled me with apprehension. Finally, I fell into a troubled doze, from which I was suddenly awakened at about 11 o'clock by hearing my baby cry, plainly and distinctly, seemingly right in the room. I knew the child's voice in 1,000, and thinking my wife had returned, I sprang out of bed. I was alone. Completely nonplussed, I walked to the door and listened. Meantime, the crying had ceased, and at length I persuaded myself that my senses had tricked me and went back to bed. The next moment that cry sounded again, loudly, piteously, my child's own voice, and somewhere in that room. I was wide awake, and when I found positively that no one was there, I put on my clothes and, greatly agitated, went to my brother's house, where I told him and his wife the story, adding that I was positive that something had happened to my baby. Of course they laughed at me, insisted that I was dreaming, and finding the matter altogether too incredible for belief, I returned home, where I tossed on the bed until morning, listening in vain for a repetition of the cry. I could not shake off the memory of the visitation or the conviction that it conveyed a warning, and during the morning I told my brother repeatedly that I was sure some accident had happened to the baby. Before noon, a boy came galloping up on horseback with a telegram in his hand. There's the bad news, I said, and so it was. The message was from my wife, calling me to Georgia and telling me that her little child had been burned to death. My distress, as I instantly started, may be imagined, but surely not described, for the certitude was impressed upon me that the dead child's last cry for help had been to me. It was raining hard, but I did not notice it. Yet this storm followed me like a nemesis, delaying me twice by washouts, and when I arrived, the baby was buried. The rest is soon told. My wife had taken the child to bed, had missed it in the night, and it was found dead in the open hearth where it had crawled and fallen. It was the night I heard the cry, and happened as nearly as could be judged at about 11 o'clock. So, I get chill bumps reading it. Spooky, scary stuff. So that was written in a book you can read today about this guy and what he saw and what he heard about his departed child right there. Moving ahead, we have a lot of locals and non-locals that move into Suwannee County and the surrounding area, and they use the timber, that virgin timber, especially the virgin timber they're using to establish great sawmills. One of them is a guy by the name of Thomas Dowling, born in 1851 in Hamilton County. By the 1880s, he moves over to the Suwannee County in Live Oak, sees there's a lot more to offer here, and so he starts establishing sawmills in Live Oak, first off, and then as he cuts out the timber around Live Oak, starts moving further and further westward. He also builds the city's first waterworks, and up until rather recently, it was the oldest used in the nation, apparently, the old water tower. And then he, by way of expanding his sawmills and railroads, he established a place called Hudson upon the Suwannee, or got to a place called Hudson upon the Suwannee, and then established a sawmill there. He employed hundreds of workers. The locals were so glad that he had brought that there that they renamed the place Dowling Park. So Hudson upon the Suwannee became Dowling Park, and that sawmill operated for decades there, providing a lot of money for the community. He was one of the first people in Florida, and almost certainly in Live Oak, to own an automobile, or a horseless carriage, as they called it back then. It was a steam-powered version, and that's kind of a picture of it right there on the right. It didn't have a steering wheel. The early cars didn't have steering wheels, They had handles or pitchfork looking things sometimes. And they were steam powered, so they had a lot of smoke coming out. You can see a picture of him right there. Sometimes he had a beard, or like a Van Dyke kind of thing sometimes. Not there, but some people would have that. So, on the first day he drove that vehicle into town in Live Oak, you've got an African-American janitor by the name of Sam McGinnis who worked at the Suwannee Democrat building. He thought the devil was coming to get him, so he ran out and dropped down in the road and was praying. So just picture that as a steam-powered car with a guy that looks like he's using a pitchfork and has a beard and all that kind of stuff is driving towards you. So kind of scary. He built this house that still exists, still a restaurant at this point, but he built this house for himself by the 1890s. Beautiful home. But I've heard several stories of Mr. Dowling still haunting that house. People have seen him upstairs, peering out of the windows upstairs, and also sometimes even downstairs, peering out of the door, his ghost. So, passing that one along. Who knows? Several folks have said they've seen him, though, over the years. Moving ahead, this is not so much ghostly stuff, but it's what's called the skunk ape, the swamp ape, or the swamp Sasquatch. Anybody heard of this? Okay. I forgot about it. I was working. I was like, oh yeah, I need to probably put this in too. But the skunk ape, a mythical creature reported to live in the southeast, but particularly in Florida. Kind of like the cousin to Bigfoot, I guess you could say. Not quite as big as Bigfoot, but hairy, ape-like, walking like a human, 5 to 7 feet tall, 450 pounds, give or take a few. Mottled reddish brown hair, and it gets its name because if you get close to it, it smells like a skunk and wet dog kind of thing. So it's skunk ape. He's found in swamps, which is why he's called swamp ape, and a swamp Sasquatch. But lots of sightings supposedly of them hundreds of years ago even. In 1818, Apalachicola described a man-sized donkey that was raiding food stores and stalking fishermen along the shore. That was in 1818. Even that, the Seminole Indians and the Miccosukee, who were cousins to the Seminoles, they talk about in their culture, there's a creature called the Esti Kapkaki. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But basically a foul-smelling, powerful, secretive creature that walks around. And that Esti Kapkaki, or however you pronounce it in that Seminole tongue, translates to either furry tall man or hairy giant. So they might have something like that in their own culture. So who knows? But one of the stories, and one of the first times in modern history it's mentioned, and I've got to check our newspapers to see if it's in it. But in 1942, a man in Suwannee County was traveling on an isolated road, and he claimed that a creature, this kind of creature, rushed at him from the bushes. He grabbed him to his vehicle, started beating on the running board in the door, and that happened for about half a mile before he finally dropped off and went back into the bushes, into the tree line. So there's been lots of stories like that. Sightings were especially heavy in the 1950s to the 1970s, and basically every county in the state reported them during that 20-year period. Even in 1977, somebody proposed a bill in the Florida legislature to make it illegal to, quote, take, possess, harm, or molest anthropoids or humanoid animals. It did not pass, but it was proposed because of things like this, the skunk ape. Since 2010, so the last 15 years basically, 48 out of 67 counties have reported seeing the skunk ape. So, I mean, who knows? Who knows? Scientists think different things. Maybe it's hoaxes, people playing games. Some of them think perhaps they're misidentifying it as other wildlife. Others say perhaps it is like an American black bear, perhaps it has the mange. Things like that. So different reasons for it, but who knows? But that's kind of one of those weird hunted. You find them in the swamps. This is somebody's made this, and that's a picture that was taken about 20 years ago or so, supposedly by a woman who found it on her porch, and as it was going away, she was able to take that picture supposedly. And there's some videos out there too, but I mean, I'm just passing it off because that's what has been told. Not so much a ghost, although it wouldn't surprise me. Willie James Howard died in a terrible way. Willie James Howard was a 15-year-old African-American boy. Middle of World War II, 1944, he was working at one of the local stores. And basically what had happened was he sent a white girl that worked with him this letter, part of this letter. I kind of cut and pasted it to fit on here. But he basically sent her a love letter, so to speak. The girl's dad did not take too kindly to it. Her dad was a prominent man by the name of Philip Goff. He was a prominent businessman, former state legislator. So Mr. Goff got a couple of his friends who were also prominent folks and picked up Willie James Howard, and his dad took him to the Suwannee River there at Suwannee Springs. And according to the men, they wanted the dad to whip the boy for having basically written a love letter to a white girl. And the boy refused to have that done, so he jumped in the river and drowned. Mr. Howard signed a sworn affidavit stating that too, and then that same day he and his wife left Suwannee County. Once they got out of Suwannee County, he wrote another affidavit saying he was forced to do that basically more or less at gunpoint, and that's not what really happened. Basically, Mr. Goff and his friends took Willie James and tied him up and basically said you can either die by being shot or drowning in the river, and he chose to drown in the river. Pretty bad stuff going on. There was some inquest into it, even folks here, I believe I talked about last month in the African American history presentation. Thurgood Marshall here on the left, who was a civil rights lawyer and later became our first African American Supreme Court justice. And then on the right was Harry T. Moore, a Suwannee County native who was big into civil rights during the 50s, 40s and 50s, helped run the NAACP in Florida, things like that. They tried to get the governor to do something, but it really led nowhere. No one was ever charged with the crime, and one of those sad things. The daughter, the girl who received it, according to one of her friends who recently died, this girl was distraught, had a nervous breakdown over what had happened. She was so upset over what had happened to Willie, because he sounded like he was a nice guy. He just, wrong kind of time to be doing that, unfortunately, according to the sensibilities of the time, unfortunately. So, kind of not a ghost story per se, but just not a good story. But it is part of our history. J.W. Bryson. J.W. Bryson was clerk of the court from 1905 to 1933. He was our longest serving clerk of the court, so basically my boss's predecessor at the courthouse. The courthouse was built in 1904, so basically he moved into it when it was brand new as the clerk, served for 28 years. And then after that, he worked as basically as a title researcher. So that's what people use before you buy a property. You make sure it's legal to buy and sell and all that stuff. So these folks come to the courthouse, especially back then, before the internet and stuff. You would come to the courthouse, you would spend hours poring over official records, our documents, our deeds, civil cases, those kinds of things. So Mr. Bryson spent practically all of his adult life at the courthouse. 60 plus years as either working there or as a frequent visitor most days. People told me stories about him and seeing him coming in there even as an older man. But it is said that when I started there almost 26 years ago now, next month will be 26 years there. When I started there, I had heard this story, and I've heard it from time to time since then. But it is said that his ghost still walks the courthouse, causing mayhem. And pretty much the running joke with us is whenever something messes up, maybe a computer's on when it was off when you left the night before, or vice versa, or maybe a chair wasn't quite where you remember leaving it, we always blame Mr. Bryson. It was Mr. Bryson's ghost that did it. So it's one of those old stories. Now this guy doesn't have a ghost about him, but he's creepy enough without it. Ted Bundy, so I got to throw him in here. 1978 became probably not only Florida, but probably America's most well-known or infamous serial killer of recent times. He was captured, vicious murdering spree. The last victim was 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from Columbia County, whose body was found here in Suwannee County. close to the state park. He was found guilty of her murder and a lot of other murders, sentenced to die. Eventually, he was executed. I was homesick from school that day, so I got to see the news reports where he was executed. Don't know how many people he killed, between 29 and over 100. Generally speaking, they say they know 35. And he would kind of push off his execution by saying, hey, you let me stick around a bit longer, I'll tell you where another body is. But eventually it was time to go. They got tired of that. So he was executed in 1989. So he was one of those creepy folks, not a ghost, hopefully. Creepy guy without it. And then we have a creepy woman. A few years later, Eileen Wuornos, another creepy person. Between 1989 and 1990, she killed 7 men. She was a prostitute. She claimed initially, that she was defending herself. She eventually just flat out admitted, I just killed him. It wasn't in self-defense. But she killed 7 men. She was nicknamed the Damsel of Death. She was found guilty of 6 of the murders. The reason that she wasn't found guilty of the 7th is because they never found the body. But she was found guilty of 6 murders. And one of the last victims, I think the next to last victim, the connection to Suwannee County is that victim's car was found in Suwannee County. So she came through Suwannee County. She was executed in 2002. And she was the second female executed in Florida since we became a state. So that was a little bit of connection to Suwannee County there. Again, not a ghost per se, but creepy. I actually knew the folks who cremated her body. They owned the cremation service, and so they remember cremating the body. Yeah, creepy woman. Creepy. Suwannee Springs. There is a story that I have heard in the last few years, so I'm passing it on to y'all. There's a story that there's either a ghost or some sort of witch that haunts the old Suwannee Springs Bridge north of Live Oak by Spirit of the Suwannee at night. That spring, which you can see at the very top, that was the Sulphur Springs at one point, Suwannee Sulphur Springs, or Lower Mineral Springs, depending on what year. But it was used by the Native Americans for its medicinal purposes, and even early Americans. It became a resort. In the mid to late 1800s, there were lots of people that would come from all over the world to Suwannee County to visit Suwannee Springs or White Springs and places like that because they believed that water could heal them. Eventually they realized Sulphur Springs, the sulfur, it stinks, it's not going to help you there. So they stopped going and the hotels burned down for the most part. But yeah, a lot of people would come here to be healed. So the suggestion is perhaps this ghost is one of those Native Americans of yesteryear that would come there for medicinal purposes, or perhaps an American that was traveling there to be healed and they didn't make it. So who knows? Maybe they're still looking for someone or something to put in their potions. So that's one of the ghosts. Side note, my great-grandfather helped build that bridge in the early 1930s. In between farming. Farming wasn't cutting it right then, so my great-grandfather went to help build it. He didn't much care for it, so went back to farming and never left after that. I believe it opened in 1931, so. He was young, he was still young. He was born in 1911. All right, other ghosts along the Suwannee River. A few stories I'll just read to you. Let's see. There was a young boy that was fishing in his favorite water hole on the banks of the Suwannee River, and he met another boy about his age. So the two hit it off. They chatted for the rest of the afternoon as they fished at the river, and then the boy returns home. A couple days later, they come back at the same fishing spot, and there's a man standing there, and the man is telling this little boy and his dad that he is there because his son had died there 8 years before, had drowned there at that spot. So he's honoring his dead son. And then that man who's lost his son shows the young boy a picture of the boy, and that was the same boy that he'd been playing with the day before. So who knows? And a related story to that could be the origin for it, or just another story related to it. It talks about a boy who's young as 6 children, and his father just had too many kids. And he decided, I'm going to drown his son during a fishing trip. And so since then, that boy has been haunting the river, seeking friends to spend eternity with him. So that's another one of the stories that I've read about. 2009, so not too long ago, there was a 6-year-old boy who jumped in the river near Bell. And while they were trying to rescue the child, the stepmom felt something drag them into the river, but she escaped whatever it was, and then she saw a pale child watch from the riverbank. The pale child watched the 6-year-old while the stepmother resuscitated him, but then disappeared when the boy began breathing on his own. So perhaps that's that same boy, perhaps not, we don't know. Perhaps he was waiting for his eternal playmate, and the boy revived. Other ghosts in and around Suwannee County. I'm just going to read some of these quotes from folks that I've found over the years. I lived in Live Oak for 13 years. When I was 6 to 8 years old, there was this boy, he was about 4 or 5 years old, and he would ride this tricycle through our living room. I remember that I would wait for him to come out at 9 p.m. Most of the time I was supposed to be asleep, but he would wake me up with his laughter. We would play, you know how it is with little kids. We would run through the house, well, me run, him ride. No one ever saw him, so my mother got scared. Then one day I was waiting, and of course he came. Then I saw this shadow go across him, and he was gone. Then the screaming started. I didn't know where it was from or what was making it. All I knew was that my friend was gone, and something evil replaced him. After he left, this shadow thing would follow me around the house, shoving things off the shelves above me and making lights explode. There was always a feeling of someone watching me, and it was not in a good way either. It felt like it was sad but evil. After a month or two of that, my mom decided to leave, so we moved away to County Road 136. It was all good. Nothing bothered me anymore, but sometimes when I feel very sad or mad, I can still feel something watching me. I know it may sound weird, but I think it's still there, but just hanging on the edge waiting for something, but I don't know what. Someday maybe it will go away. That was an anonymous writer writing about it. Here's another one. As a child, I lived in a house in Live Oak and played with a little girl in the attic. She had long brown hair and always wore a pleasant, I don't know if maybe it's peasant style dress. She was also about my age, 6 years old. I'm the only one who ever saw her, but many people heard her walking and running in the attic, only they didn't know what they were hearing. I never knew her name, and I can't remember her face, but she often unlocked doors that had been locked, moved things around, and did mischievous things that I would get blamed for. No one believed me about the little brown-haired girl. I'm convinced that she exists in that house on Pine Avenue. Those are houses on Pine Avenue that are old. I don't know which one. I'm just saying those are some of the houses. Another one mentions that I lived on Pine Avenue and there was a ghost in our attic as well. My mother used to live in the attic, but she only stayed there for a few days and refused to go back up there. So, some of these old houses that we've got in town sound like they might be spooked. I have ghosts there. Another one. Another story. Okay. And this happened in my lifetime anyway, based on the names and stuff. Probably 15, 20 years ago, I think I heard about it. But basically on a Sunday, on County Road 136, this woman was driving back home from church with her daughter and an exchange student. And the daughter noticed a little girl by the roadside. And she was overcome by a feeling that something was not right. So when the mother turned the car around to check on what they thought was the little girl, the group discovered that it was in fact a teenager sitting with her knees curled up, rocking. They drove a short distance past her and turned around again only to find the girl had disappeared. So they dismissed it as maybe a girl just walking back into the woods. But the daughter was very unsettled, so they drove for another couple miles when again this daughter sees the girl in headlights. So the daughter begins freaking out, is convinced it's not humanly possible to move that fast on foot. So she becomes sick to her stomach, insists that they just go, but the mother insisted, let's stop and make sure the girl doesn't need help. So the daughter curls into a fetal position on the floor of the car. She's convinced that the situation is wrong, it's not good. The mother leans over, rolls down the window to see if the girl needs help. The mother's daughter is overcome with dread. Finally, the girl turns to face them, but she doesn't have a face. Her face is hollow, and there's nothing there. So the mother, who was usually a cautious driver, sped off and went home. She called 911 to report a girl by the side of the road needing assistance. The police searched and found nothing, but not there long thereafter, the daughter discovered that a girl from her school had died in a car crash in the same place. So, I mean, kind of scary thinking about that. So all these, are either ghost stories or weird happenings here in Suwannee County. And it's much better at night around Halloween to do this presentation. And with kids, it freaks the kids out sometimes. But any thoughts, comments, or questions? Next month we're going to get into a section of this study that I do, and we're going to be getting into different towns or communities. So next month we'll start with Live Oak, and we'll hit Branford and Dowling Park, O'Brien, McAlpin, those kinds of things. As we're continuing our, what's now a 3.5-year study of Suwannee County's history. So any thoughts, comments, or questions? Appreciate y'all attending. Thank y'all.
Is